The West is notorious for being a hypocrite, and this is proven when we see what it did in Africa. Around the world, the West advocates for democracy, respect for other countries' sovereignties, human rights, and policy of non-intervention. However, this is hypocrisy because the West only wants principles for itself. When it comes to respecting the sovereignties of countries from Africa and Asia, the West always tries to find loopholes. No attention is paid to the human rights of the people belonging to non-Western countries. Countries like the United States, France, and the United Kingdom use democracy as an excuse to invade countries, which they did with Libya and Iraq. But when the very people of those countries don't want a Western style of democracy, how can the West impose it on them? Well, it is done because it benefits the West, making other nations subordinate and dependent. What's tragic is that the United Nations also joins these Western countries in their hypocrisy and exploitation of African countries. So, how have France, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the United Nations been hypocrites, looting Africa, and selectively following international laws and principles? Let's reveal everything in this video. Hypocrisy means saying something, but doing something else. It's like advocating for mutual respect and growth, but suppressing other countries at the extremes. The best examples in the international world are shown by the Western countries who advocate for moral principles and mutual respect, but their actions are far from that. Perhaps they want themselves to be treated with respect, their sovereignties to be protected, and their human rights to be safeguarded. But when it comes to doing the same for other countries, Western countries like France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and even the United Nations make excuses. It shows that for the West, only their people and institutions are to be respected, and in doing so, people of non-Western countries can be compromised. That's the mentality that has developed in centuries when the Western powers colonized various parts of the world. They did not care about the colony's population. Rather, those were just tools for the West to grow, develop, and profit. Today is no different. France, the United States, and the UK, despite their professed dedication to democracy, often engage in hypocritical actions, especially when attempting to impose their views on African nations. This hypocrisy is evident not only in their external policies, but also within the United Nations, where they advocate for human rights and democracy in developing countries without consistently adhering to these principles. While proclaiming their commitment to democracy, these nations have turned the United Nations into a platform where they wield veto power based on their preferences, disregarding the majority's voice. They actively involve themselves in the internal policies of African countries despite these nations being sovereign states. This interference contradicts the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of states, as outlined in the United Nations Charter. Unfortunately, countries with veto power consistently neglect this crucial aspect of the Charter. While quick to criticize African countries or any nation deviating from democracy, labeling them as autocratic and imposing sanctions, these nations themselves exercise autocratic power within the United Nations. Over the years, they portrayed Gaddafi as a brutal autocrat, condemning his leadership style as detrimental to human rights. This criticism persisted until they found a way to remove him from power, leading to the transformation of Libya from the wealthiest nation in Africa under Gaddafi to one of the poorest globally. At this year's United Nations General Assembly meeting, Mamadi Doumbouya, who assumed leadership in Guinea through a military coup in 2021, voiced criticism against countries that condemn African military leaders taking charge of their nations. He argued that democracy's failure in Africa isn't due to inherent flaws, but stems from being imposed on the continent with hidden agendas by the West. The imposition of democracy on African countries by the West, as evidenced by recent events, goes beyond the concept of democracy itself. France, the US, and other nations, while unwilling to accept democracy within the UN, are quick to sanction African nations deviating from democratic norms. A striking example is the recent sanctions imposed by the European Union on the military leadership of Niger. The EU, a significant aid contributor to Niger, ceased aid and imposed travel bans and asset freezes on all individuals associated with the military coup. France, historically implicated in some of Africa's darkest events, followed suit by discontinuing aid to Niger. The United States, along with Canada, the Netherlands, and even the World Bank, intervened by imposing sanctions on Niger. These sanctions extended beyond Niger alone. Other West African nations that experienced military takeovers, such as Mali and Burkina Faso, faced sanctions from foreign superpowers, particularly France. The irony of France's involvement in sanctioning African countries due to military takeovers becomes apparent when considering its historical actions on the continent. Former French colonies in West Africa have seen a significant number of military coups, often initiated by the French government. These coups led to the deaths of democratically elected leaders, including Sylvanus Olympio of Togo, Modibo Keïta of Mali, Maurice Yameogo of Burkina Faso, and David Dacko of the Central African Republic. Despite being elected by their people, France's influence led to the establishment of military governments in these nations. Similarly, the United States, Belgium, and the UK collaborated to support the rebellion that resulted in the assassination of elected Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Despite this history, these nations now advocate for democracy across Africa. However, their actions in the past, coupled with their veto powers in the United Nations, reveal a double standard. They cling to veto power in the US but promote a democracy in African countries, demonstrating that they value democracy only when it aligns with their interests. Otherwise, democracy becomes irrelevant to them. These countries are hypocritical, and their actions have significantly contributed to today's world's challenges. African leaders acting as puppets to these nations must recognize this reality and work towards lifting their nations out of the poor state imposed by external influences. Empowering their countries independently can pave the way for progress and development, free from the constraints imposed by foreign interests. The United States frequently presents itself as a champion of democracy, human rights, and the sovereignty of other nations. However, historical instances indicate that the U.S. has shown inconsistency in applying these principles, especially in its interactions with African countries. During the Cold War, the United States gained recognition for supporting authoritarian regimes in Africa that aligned with its geopolitical goals. This support contradicted the democratic and human rights principles the U.S. purportedly upholds. For instance, the U.S. backed Mobutu Sese Seko in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, despite his autocratic rule and human rights abuses. Mobutu Sese Seko's ascent to power in a 1965 coup marked the beginning of a 3-decade-long dictatorial rule, characterized by corruption, human rights abuses, and a cult of personality. Despite Mobutu's autocratic governance, the U.S. backed him during the Cold War due to his anti-communist stance and alignment with American geopolitical interests. This support prioritized strategic gains over the promotion of democracy and human rights, revealing a pragmatic approach that contradicted the U.S.'s proclaimed commitment to these principles. The U.S. also supported interventions and coups that ousted democratically elected leaders in African nations. An example is the U.S. involvement in the overthrow of the government of Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the 1960s, going against the principles of respecting the sovereign decisions of other nations. Even the U.S. tended to be selective in condemning human rights abuses, often focusing more on countries that do not align with its strategic interests. This selectivity is seen as a form of hypocrisy, compromising the consistency of the U.S. stance on human rights. What's more, the U.S. has wielded its veto power in international organizations, including the United Nations, to shield itself and its allies from accountability for alleged human rights violations. Instances abound where U.S. allies, facing accusations of abuses, were protected from international scrutiny through U.S. vetoes. Hence, double standards exist that the U.S. leverages its influence to shield allies, thereby undermining the credibility of international efforts to address human rights violations. But the U.S. is not alone in the hypocrisy. The UK's historical colonial legacy in Africa shows a tale marked by the imposition of colonial rule, often executed without the genuine consent of local populations. This period saw African nations subjected to British imperial interests, prompting profound questions about the UK's dedication to the sovereignty and self-determination of these nations. The extraction of valuable resources and the establishment of governance structures heavily favored colonial interests, presenting a glaring contradiction with the proclaimed principles of democracy and sovereignty. The repercussions of this historical legacy persist, influencing perceptions of the UK's engagement with Africa. Moving into the post-colonial era, the UK's involvement in African nations has included military interventions framed as humanitarian help, drawing both attention and skepticism. These interventions, ostensibly geared toward protecting human rights, inadvertently infringed upon the sovereignty of nations to manage their internal affairs. This raises pertinent questions about the alignment of the UK's actions with its advocacy for democratic governance and respect for the sovereignty of nations. The economic dimension further complicates the UK's interactions with African nations. The emphasis on the UK's economic interests in Africa, spanning trade partnerships to investment relationships, has been prominently highlighted in its engagements. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Pursuing these economic interests may lead the UK to compromise on its consistent advocacy for human rights. Economic considerations, particularly in nations with significant economic ties to the UK, can potentially influence its approach to addressing human rights abuses, introducing a nuanced layer to the dynamics of the UK-Africa relationship. What's more, the UK's response to human rights abuses in African nations has been criticized for being selective. It tends to take a more assertive stance on human rights issues in countries that are not strategic allies while being less vocal about abuses in nations with closer ties. This perceived double standard suggests that the UK prioritizes geopolitical interests over consistent adherence to universal human rights principles, undermining its commitment to promoting human rights globally. Then comes French hypocrisy. France's historical colonial legacy in Africa is marked by the imposition of colonial rule and the exploitation of resources, often without the genuine consent of local populations. During the colonial era, France's presence involved extracting valuable resources, establishing governance structures that favored colonial interests, and a disregard for the sovereignty and self-determination of African nations. This historical context raises questions about France's commitment to the principles of democracy and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. While advocating for democracy globally, France has faced criticism for its selective application of democratic values in its interactions with African countries. France has supported leaders who aligned with its geopolitical interests, even if they fell short of democratic standards. This perceived double standard undermines France's credibility in promoting democratic governance and respecting the sovereignty of nations. What's more, France's economic relationships with African nations, both during and after the colonial period, have been marked by imbalances and exploitation. Unfavorable trade practices and economic policies have often disadvantaged African economies. Despite advocating for fair trade and economic development, France's policies contributed to economic disparities. The exploitation of economic relationships, especially in regions historically tied to France, demonstrated a contradiction with its professed principles. France's military interventions in African nations, often presented as efforts to address security concerns, have encountered scrutiny. In reality, these interventions carried neo-colonial undertones, raising questions about France's commitment to respecting the sovereignty of African nations. France's involvement in the internal affairs of African countries under the pretext of security concerns was its deep hypocrisy. These actions are inconsistent with its advocacy for non-intervention in other regions. But there is something else that is more tragic. The United Nations itself has double standards and is a hypocrite toward Africa. It often presents itself as a global champion for democracy, human rights, and the respect of sovereignties across nations, advocating for equal treatment worldwide. However, criticisms have surfaced, especially regarding how these principles are applied, with accusations suggesting that the UN tends to show favoritism toward Western nations. A central criticism revolves around the selective application of democratic and human rights standards. Despite the UN's universal promotion of these principles, history has shown us that enforcement and scrutiny are not consistently applied. Western nations often undergo less rigorous evaluation for their actions, while African countries in particular face more stringent assessments. This perceived double standard prompts questions about the UN's commitment to democracy and human rights on a global scale. Furthermore, the UN's handling of sovereignty-related issues has faced scrutiny. Despite advocating for the respect of national sovereignties, interventions in specific regions, often spearheaded by Western nations, have stirred controversy. Some argue that the UN's involvement in conflicts or political situations in African countries may not always align with its principles of non-interference and respect for sovereignty. We can see this by studying history. The Democratic Republic of Congo has been trapped in an internal conflict involving various armed groups and neighboring countries. The UN's peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, has been operational to grapple with the complex challenges in the region. However, the UN's engagement in the DRC has been tainted by irregularities. Despite championing the principles of peace and stability, the organization has been poorly addressing the root causes of the conflict, such as resource exploitation and external interference. It appears that the United Nations peacekeeping troops had gone to ensure conflicts remained, rather than doing the opposite. The UN's failure to hold external actors accountable for their role in exacerbating the conflict has sparked doubts about its commitment to comprehensive peacebuilding. The Rwandan genocide showed yet another UN's hypocrisy. Unfolded in 1994, it resulted in the mass killing of ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus. The UN's peacekeeping mission, UNAMIR, grappled with challenges in responding to the rapidly escalating violence. The UN's reaction to the Rwandan genocide is frequently cited as a failure of international intervention. Despite receiving warnings and witnessing the unfolding atrocities, the UN Security Council, under the pressure of some member states, opted to reduce the size of the peacekeeping mission instead of reinforcing it. This decision has been criticized as a failure to uphold the responsibility to protect and prevent mass atrocities, revealing a gap between the UN's rhetoric and actions. Again, in 2011, we saw another instant when the UN was paralyzed by the West and used as a tool. The Libyan civil war erupted in 2011, resulting in widespread violence. The UN Security Council authorized military intervention to protect civilians. However, the UN's involvement in Libya surpassed the initially stated humanitarian mandate. The military intervention, led by NATO forces, escalated, destabilizing the region. The aftermath of the intervention highlighted a gap between the UN's commitment to protecting civilians and the unintended consequences of the military action, prompting questions about the organization's strategic planning and long-term considerations. That's when it becomes clear that entities like the UN, World Bank, IMF, IAEA, and others are fundamentally devoid of a truly international character and are tools wielded by imperialist powers. Numerous international organizations present themselves as champions for global peace, freedom, and justice. Chief among them is the United Nations, including both the General Assembly and the Security Council. However, additional entities mask their true functions behind deceptive rhetoric, including the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund (IMF), the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the World Trade Organization. Western human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch also fall into this category. In the past 2 decades, the International Criminal Court has also joined this list, almost overshadowing the International Court of Justice. While all nations worldwide are UN members, several non-governmental organizations hold affiliate status. Despite playing beneficial roles in cultural and social domains, UN organs' political performance is notably dismal. This traces back to the UN's origins, established as the Second World War concluded, with victors ensuring protection of their interests through veto power in the Security Council. Simultaneously, the World Bank and IMF emerged as instruments of financial control for the rest of the world. The Security Council, consisting of 15 members, includes 5 permanent veto-wielding nations: the US, Britain, France, Russia, and China. The deployment of this unfair and undemocratic tool safeguards their interests and those of their allies. The US, in particular, extensively exercises the veto, often shielding its allies from being prosecuted. Despite its apparent purpose to prevent wars and facilitate peaceful conflict resolution, the UN's track record suggests otherwise. Instead of preventing wars, it has at times contributed to enabling genocide. lingering issues dating back to its establishment remain unresolved. The list of UN wrongdoings is extensive, largely because it operates as a tool of US Western imperialism. Despite the frequent mention of the UN Charter in speeches delivered from the General Assembly podium, regular breaches of the Charter go without any condemnation. What's more, the activities of the International Criminal Court, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch are also doubtful. Despite the US not ratifying the ICC protocol, it exploits the body to target opponents. Notably, only individuals opposing US Western policies have been brought before the ICC. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are similarly employed to target countries opposing Western hegemony, downplaying the egregious crimes of Western regimes or their allies. That's why we always see the West quoting reports from these organizations about Africa's human rights violations. But the reality is that these reports are exaggerated, and reports about human rights violations in the West are hidden. Even when these bodies issue reports against Western regimes, the corporate-controlled media conveniently downplays them. What do you think? Does the West respect the sovereignty of African countries? Isn't it true that concepts like democracy, human rights, and non-interference are just superficial, which the West uses to creep into Africa? Let us know your thoughts on how the West can be avoided from entering and polluting Africa with its fractured and superficial ideas. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.